Welcome to the latest in the of the archaeology talks. This one, as you can see from the title slide, called Both Sides of the Forth. I'll come back to that, to the where, the what, and the why. But I thought I'd start with an object. Archaeology is at least half about objects, things, things made by humans, and what we can learn from them. And I think this is a particularly lovely one. I like it. I haven't seen it for years. It's a museum I haven't been to since I was a child, but I'm hoping to go back to as soon as I possibly can. And it's a box. It's a box made from a mussel shell, the shell of a very large mussel. Then that mussel shell has been cleaned and polished, and an engraved silver rim has been added around the edges with a hinge and a clasp, so it opens like the shell would open when it was alive, but with a hinge now. The box is mounted on 4 silver legs, which are also engraved, and inside the box is lined with blue velvet, and a plaque on the hinge describes when and where it was caught. And when and where it was caught was in the Firth of Forth, between Anstruther and the Isle of May, and it was caught in July 1895, and a J.J. Weir caught it on a fishing line. It's a particularly large specimen of mussel, the mussel inside weighing 3/4 pound, which is about 340 grams. So yeah, I've put it up as sort of symbolic of the Forth itself, of the archaeology of the Forth, of human activity on the Forth, and the museums and collections that we can go to visit along the Forth, and the information that these objects give us, which is not just about human behaviour, but about the past environments and the productivity of the sea. It would be very difficult to catch a mussel of this size in the Forth today. It was probably quite big for its time, but it would be much more common to have large shells like this in the 1890s than it is today. And that's another thing archaeology can give us information on. It's not just past human behaviour, but past environments. So what is this environment? Where are we talking about? I'm sure everyone watching this is familiar, if not actually had this view. I think this was taken by a drone, aerial view of the 3 bridges over the Firth of Forth. Why are we talking about the Firth of Forth today, other than it's just intrinsically interesting in and of itself? Well, there's a Dick Gaughan song called "Both Sides of the Tweed," and that was sort of influential upon me thinking about this and these ideas that we're going to be talking about. And of course, the Gaughan song "Both Sides of the Tweed" is about the River Tweed, not the Firth of Forth, and also about the fact of the River Tweed being the political border between England and Scotland for centuries. It's a place where history has happened for centuries, and history has been fought over, literally, and people argued about. So rivers and seas, big rivers like the Tweed and like the Firth of Forth, can be seen to form natural borders, if you like, barriers to the movement of people, borders to the edges of sort of social organisation, and some of what we're going to look at will include that. For example, the Firth of Forth, where we're talking about, formed the southern boundary of Pictland, as we'll see, and the northern boundary of the Anglian Kingdom of Northumbria in the early Middle Ages. But rivers and seas are not just borders, and they're certainly rarely barriers. They're also highways, routes for people, routes for travelling, routes for goods, and in the case of the Firth of Forth, for bringing people and goods right into the heart of Scotland. From all of prehistory and most of history, it was actually quicker and easier to travel by water than it was to travel over land. This fact that ships could bring large bodies of armed men into Scotland very quickly from wherever has been suggested as the reason why both Dunfermline, which is the old capital of Scotland, and Edinburgh, which is the current capital and has been since the Middle Ages, are actually not sited directly on the river. They're sited away from the Forth for security, to give themselves a bit of a gap between the Forth and themselves. The three bridges, as we've mentioned, iconic, not just iconic, but recognised as such the world over, in particular in the foreground. The Forth Bridge, the rail bridge, is now a World Heritage Site, opened in 1890 and is considered one of, if not the finest example of its class of a 19th century rail bridge. As I say, recognised by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. Within the boundaries of the area we're talking about today, it's one of three World Heritage Sites. Edinburgh, Walden Newtown is one, and the Antonine Wall is the other World Heritage Site within our little region for today. We're going to be talking about the land on either side of the river, the land on either side of the Firth of Forth. Don't forget also the islands. We can see one just in front of the rail bridge. There are multiple islands on the Forth. These also are sites of past human activity. Some of them were hospitals, some of them were used as isolation hospitals for people with diseases like leprosy and syphilis. Some of them have religious institutions built on them, monasteries where monks could sort of withdraw from society, and many of them have military installations, particularly 20th century, First World War and Second World War. So much so that at one point the islands and the Forth were described as the most powerful naval fortress in the British Empire. They're also the site, almost exactly where we're, the viewpoint of this slide was the place for the first aerial battle over Britain of World War II was fought here on the 16th of October 1939, when German bombers attacked the naval base at Rosyth and were engaged by Spitfires of 603 Squadron based at Turnhouse Airfield. Turnhouse Airfield is now better known as Edinburgh Airport. Quick contemporary map of our area, the Firth of Forth. We all know where we are. Most people looking at this will be in Edinburgh. The Forth itself, 20 miles wide at the mouth, from Fife Ness to Dunbar in East Lothian, and 60 miles long. 60 miles long as measured from the mouth to Craig Forth, just upstream of Stirling, if you can see my cursor. Craig Forth is chosen as the length of the Firth because that's at the point at which it stops becoming tidal. So it's tidal all the way from the North Sea to just upstream of Stirling. And we're going to take a chronological journey. We're not going to travel downstream to the sea as such. We're going to come through time from prehistory up to relatively recent times, and we'll jump from north to south and up and downstream as we travel through time. But speaking of traveling through time, how was the Firth of Forth perceived in the past? How did people think about our area in the past? Well, we get a good idea of that from this map, the Matthew Paris map, or a map made by Matthew Paris, around about AD 1250. Paris was a monk. He was a monk based at a monastery in St Albans in Hertfordshire in England, and he apparently didn't travel very far from there. He drew his maps based on travellers' tales, other people's tales, other people telling him of the geography of the areas that he'd travelled to. So this is probably one of the finest maps of its time, and it's a mixture of, if you try to map this map onto a modern map, it doesn't quite work, but at the same time you can tell what and where he's talking about, if you like. Southern England, Cornwall sticking out here, Wales. Interestingly, from an archaeologist's perspective, Paris was clearly aware of both the Roman walls. You can see Hadrian's wall is marked in here, and the Antonine wall is marked in here, and Scotland is said to start somewhere between the walls. His geography, as I say, is probably the best of its time, but is problematic, shall we say. His geography of Scotland in particular, although his geography of England is a little bit wonky as well. But we're talking about the Firth of Forth, which is here. And if you can see, Scotland is basically Scotland north of the Forth is basically an island. He calls it, you can see it written here, Scotia Ultramarina, Scotland beyond the sea. And he assumes that the Firth of Forth and the Clyde basically joined together. And this is Stirling Bridge, the mainland, if you like, and Scotland beyond the sea, he thought were only connected at Stirling Bridge. And remember, this is before Stirling Bridge became. It obviously must have been famous at the time, but it's before the battle. It's before the famous Battle of Stirling Bridge, which was on September the 11th, 1297. So clearly the bridge was well known before then, but somehow it was thought it joined the two halves of Scotland. So this is clearly the Forth. It's actually quite well mapped there compared to now. Clearly of major significance at the time, even if his geography wasn't 100% accurate, he recognised the importance of the Firth of Forth. So we'll start our chronological journey in the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. Middle because it's between the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. And we're starting with it and not with the Paleolithic because although we now do have Paleolithic sites in Scotland, there are none yet, fingers crossed for the future, but none yet in the area we're looking at. But we do have Mesolithic, the next stage in the Stone Ages. And so old that when it was first discovered, there's a Mesolithic site at Cramond. And for a while, that was the oldest known site of human habitation in Scotland. It isn't now that we have Paleolithic. This photograph, as you can see the bridges in the background, or at least you can see the two bridges in the background. You can see the Forth Bridge and the Forth Road Bridge in the background, because this photograph was taken in advance of building the Queensferry crossing. Most archaeology in Scotland, and indeed throughout the UK, is carried out by so-called commercial units, businesses basically, but of archaeologists who excavate under planning legislation ahead of any development, any building of roads, building of bridges, building of car parks, building of houses, anything that's going to seriously turn over or damage the land. There needs to be an archaeological assessment in advance, and archaeological excavation if that is required. A lot of archaeology was done, and a lot of archaeology was found in advance of the building of the new Queensferry crossing. The archaeology began in 2011, and 2 locations were found with major discoveries of Mesolithic sites. One at Castland Hill in the north, and one at Ashline Fields in the south, which is the one we were looking at. And these have contributed significantly to our understanding of Mesolithic habitation in Scotland. It might not look like very much in this slide, this excavation, but this circular depression here is not created by the archaeologists. This is what archaeologists found, and this is the site of a house. This was dug out, and then you can see these holes. Pillars were put in to support a house, and this is now one of the oldest settlements with structures that we can call houses on it in Scotland. So this is approaching 10,000 years old. A sunken floored structure that has been radiocarbon dated from organic materials found in the bottom of it to not quite, but very nearly 10,000 years old. There were also found the remains of a hearth, stone tools. We'll see some of the stone tools in the next slide. And the other sort of interesting or unusual, if you like, thing, the bones of a wolf's paw. Nothing else from the wolf, just the remains of the wolf's paw. It looks like the wolf's paw has been brought in, a lucky charm, an ornament, but it had been brought into the house. The discovery of this house, it fits into a nice pattern of discoveries across sort of east coast of northern England and southern Scotland. We now have a Mesolithic house here on the banks of the Forth. There's one being found at Dunbar. There's one being found in Northumberland. Once upon a time, Mesolithic people were thought to be sort of wanderers in the landscape and not building houses, really living in tents. We now ever increasing evidence that, at least in our part of the world, if you like, they were much more sort of settled and the first beginnings of what might become what we might call village life. Here's the picture on the right is a reconstruction of that. And I know it looks tent-like, but it's not a tent. It's not meant to be taken down and moved. People at this time almost certainly did make tents as well, probably out of animal hides. Think of like a Native American teepee. And this is a similar design, but this is large timbers and thatch or turf on the outside. We can't be certain. Both would work. But work at I mentioned one had been a house very similar to this had been found in Northumberland. And that's given us evidence that these were used over the same site, probably not the same building. It would be rebuilt over time, but the same site was used for perhaps up to 500 years. So these were these people were not just wandering in the landscape. These people had sort of fixed homes for the first time, places where they would come back to, places that would become villages. I mentioned the stone tools. This is a small selection, and I use the word small in 2 of its meanings. It's just a selection of lots of the objects that were found, but the objects themselves are very small. If you can see from the scale, that's 2.5 centimeters. These are so-called microliths. Micro meaning very small, and lith, meaning stone. They're chipped, they're worked. These would require training and skill to make. They're not just rocks that are being banged together. They've got edges that have been made, they've been made sharp on one side and blunt on the other side. Multi-uses. These two here were probably parts, and possibly this one as well, parts of projectiles. There would multiple microliths would be stuck to a haft of wood. We have found, not in Scotland but in Denmark, ones where they're glued with tar or plant resin, to glue them into place to make quite a sophisticated arrowhead. They could also be used as multi-bladed knives, and they're sort of Swiss Army knife of the Mesolithic. It can be turned into multiple different types of tool. After the Mesolithic, I think I mentioned earlier that it's the New Stone Age, the Neolithic. A time of great technological and, we presume, also social change. These are the first farmers. This is the arrival of the first farmers, which is, and the Neolithic agriculture of a form is established in Scotland by about 4000 BC. And it comes with new technology as well. It comes with pottery for the first time. The Mesolithic people, at least in Scotland, didn't use pottery. The Neolithic people bring pottery. And then these objects that we see here are sort of iconic of the Neolithic. They're axe heads. The Mesolithic people prior to this used axes. Not as much, and they're not as common, but they definitely made them. The key difference is these are ground and polished. There's hours and hours and hours of work turning a chipped stone axe, an axe that's been where you've used one stone to knock another into the shape of the axe, like the Mesolithic people did. Well, the Neolithic people would start with that and then polish and polish and polish, down to using a piece of leather and sand and grit to make these objects, personal opinion, but to make these objects beautiful as well as utilitarian. To show that the Neolithic people were on both sides of the Forth, that the one on the left is made from quartzite and was found at Dalmeny in West Lothian, and the axe head on the right is from Tarvet Hill Farm in Cooper in Fife. So the Neolithic people were happily farming on both sides of the Forth from about 4000 BC. These are utilitarian objects in that they were used for chopping down trees, basically, clearing woodland to create fields for their crops, the domesticated crops, the first domesticated crops in Scotland. And I mentioned, I think they're also attractive objects. I feel like they're very nice, but they were clearly also hugely symbolic, symbolically significant to the Neolithic people, as well as they're often deposited in ritual circumstances. They're deposited at the base of tombs. They're deposited at the base of houses. They appear to have been deliberately broken before they're buried, so they are symbolically killed, if you like, and then given a burial. That's one side of how symbolically and culturally significant these objects were. The other aspect that we interpret as giving them meaning in the past, if you like, is that we find them throughout Scotland, and they're often made from local stone, but we also in Scotland find these axes made from stone quarried in the Lake District, the English Lake District, quarried in Wales, quarried in Ireland, both north and south, and quarried as far away as the Alps. beautifully polished, finely made stone axes found several sites in Scotland. We can tell by chemical analysis and other analyses the stone was definitely quarried in the Alps. In fact, the individual quarries have now been found in the Alps. I mentioned the change in technology and subsistence associated with the Neolithic, pottery, etc. Another thing that really comes with the Neolithic and continues on into the Bronze Age is monumental building, so-called megaliths, big stones made into tombs, made into houses, made into so-called henges, stone circles, and as with these, standing stones, of which these are 3 of the most impressive standing stones in Scotland. You don't have to go to Orkney to see impressive standing stones, although I would recommend if you can, but we have some closer to home. These are London Links in Fife. The stone on the right, the solo stone, if you like, is 5.5 meters tall. It's big. The 2 slightly closer together as a pair are both over 4 meters. One's 4.1 meters and one is 4.6 meters tall. They're thought to be unsculptured. The strange and interesting shapes are natural. They've found stones which naturally have these strange and interesting shapes and then erected them. There's, in the late 18th century, an antiquarian recorded the existence of a 4th stone, but that appears to have disappeared. We don't know where. And in 1844, there was found a coffin built of loose slabs, was exposed immediately adjoining the standing stones, and a skull was recovered, which was given to Sir William Turner, the professor of anatomy at Edinburgh University. It was fractured and is said to have had a piece of iron, the question mark raised there, that crumbled into rust on being touched in the fracture. It's possible the skull did have a piece of iron, and it's possible, and if so, that skull was not buried contemporary with the erection of these stones. These are either Neolithic or possibly Bronze Age, certainly before the coming of iron to Scotland. But that's not impossible. It's not an impossible sort of scenario. We certainly know that later peoples, Iron Age peoples, and beyond that into the Christian era, people reused old sites. So sometimes people would bury a site because it was bury a dead relative because it was the site was associated with the ancestors, if you like. So they found an Iron Age skull, but this is definitely a Neolithic into the Bronze Age monument. Like a lot of these places throughout Scotland and throughout the British Isles, these were interpreted in the past. People told stories prior to archaeology, prior to what we might think of as sort of scientific research. People told stories, had their own ideas about what these myths and legends about what standing stones were or represented, or who built them, or who created them. The new statistical account of Scotland in the 1840s records that these stones there were multiple theories, if you like, as to regard the origins of these stones, including some people thought they were put by the Romans. Some people said they were the gravestones of Danish chiefs who were defeated by Banquo and Macbeth. And other people thought, the old classic, they were connected with the Druids. It's only relatively recently that we've come to understand the real time depth of the prehistoric past, and that there was a lot of activity in Scotland, long before the Romans, long before the Druids, who probably were not here in Scotland anyway. The concepts of the Bronze Age, the concepts of the Neolithic, weren't widespread until well into the 20th century. And speaking of the Bronze Age, that's where we're going next. The next period, remember these periods, Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, nobody at the time would think I'm living in the Bronze Age. These are models, if you like, that archaeologists and historians impose on the past. It helps us understand. It measures real things, but it's not. They're not fixed categories. They're slightly fuzzy. That said, the Bronze Age certainly represents, again, like the Neolithic, it represents new materials and new technology. Big arguments in the past, big debates, discussions, scientific disagreement. Does that mean new people? Are these ideas that travel, or is it people that travel with these ideas? More and more, Bronze Age is now seen as being brought by migrants from Europe, who brought the key new technology of the Bronze Age, bronze, metal. This is the first time metal is used in Scottish history. That doesn't mean that stone just suddenly stops. Flint continues to be used as a utilitarian. So in fact, this sees a flowering and a flourishing of things like some of the finest flint arrowheads are from the Bronze Age. Bronze was special. Bronze was magical. Bronze was not available for everyday objects. But what it was available for, this is the time when we get the first true weapons. The first, so an arrow is predominantly, a bow and arrow is predominantly used for hunting. It can be used for as a weapon, i.e. For injuring other human beings. But it's only in the Bronze Age where we get objects that are clearly made specifically for that purpose, for the purpose of injuring other human beings as opposed to hunting deer. So we get swords and halberds and things that don't really have a purpose in hunting unless hunting is a fellow human being. Bronze isn't the only, metal isn't the only new technology associated with the Bronze Age. The other technology of this time that's new is what this object is on the screen. This is a wheel, a wooden wheel, found in our area, found at Blair Drummond in Perthshire, not far from the Forth. And this is the oldest and earliest preserved wheel from Scotland. And we can date this, can't date this very precisely, but it's Bronze Age and it's sometime between 1260 and 810 BC. The wheel was made of 3 pieces of ash, you can see, bound together. It's now a bit warped in shape, but it would have made a perfectly adequate wheel, as you can see in the middle where the axle would have gone through. This was probably for an ox cart. Oxen were domesticated and were almost certainly used for pulling the vehicle that this wheel came from. The horse was also domesticated in the Bronze Age, but hadn't made it to Scotland at this time when this wheel was in use. Not very long afterwards, but this wheel it's more likely that this wheel was pulled by an ox than by a horse. As we're talking about the Bronze Age, we really should see at least one object made out of bronze. Like the Neolithic, Axes are iconic in the Bronze Age as well, and these are mostly made out of metal. As I said, stone continued to flint, etc., continued to be used for arrowheads. Bronze starts to dominate in the making of axes, and the axes themselves remain as utilitarian objects. You could chop a tree down with this, and they also continue to have the symbolic status as well, carrying a lot of symbolic weight. We know this because we find these multiple times deposited in hoards, ritual deposits. Basically took a load of metal, a load of bronze. Remember, this must have been incredibly valuable to people, not necessarily in monetary terms, but as a scarce resource. And then they dump them in ponds and dump them in peat bogs and dump them in rivers and throw them in the sea, presumably as a sacrifice of some kind to the gods or to the spirits of nature or whatever. Our example today is this is an early Bronze Age axe, a so-called flat axe. The later Bronze Age axes had more 3D molding and modeling. These are the earliest ones, and they're flat, probably just a carved stone mold. And this was found in Largo in Fife, not very far from the London Link stones that we saw. Could have been contemporary with those stones. And this dates to early Bronze Age, sometime between 2150 BC and 1950 BC. Coming forward in time again brings us to the Iron Age. The Iron Age in Scotland. If you look in any textbook, it usually puts a nice round number on it, and it's usually said to start at 500 BC. Again, that's a fuzzy date. It's a nice round number for the textbooks, but that doesn't mean on January the 1st, 500 BC, iron turned up. There would have been iron. People in the quote unquote Bronze Age became aware of iron. There's a transition process. But if we have to put a date on these things, it starts the oldest iron objects in Scotland date to round about 500 BC. And it could be said it never stopped. It could be said that the Iron Age is 500 BC to the present. Certainly, if you see a fully formed Iron Age carpenter's toolkit, say, with hammers and chisels and all the rest, it doesn't look any different to one today. We are still making our everyday objects out of iron and steel, which is a variant. Other metals have been adopted, but you can make an argument we're still living in the Iron Age. This I picked this photograph to sort of try and emphasise that this is the excavation of an Iron Age site, an enclosure dated to the Iron Age at Maya Head. And as I said, the picture is to try and show that archaeology is not treasure hunting, that archaeology is the careful, painstaking. You can see, for the scale of things, you can see people in a trench there. And I think there's another one there. The painstaking removal of a lot of dirt. The painstaking clearance of what looks like a jumble of stones and holes. The careful recording of all of this. To try and build up a picture, to try and understand what this building was, what people were doing, why it might have been there. It's not all about the shiny things. This was discovered as a crop mark, so an aerial photograph showed that something vaguely circular, appears as a mark, usually during drought conditions, that there's something buried under the soil causing crops to grow at different rates in different places. And what they found when they took the soil off is an enclosure 50 meters by 40 meters, and then which was defined by a palisade trench. That's a trench in which then a fence had been built, basically. Posts had been stuck to create a palisade. There was an entrance marked by 2 or more massive posts flanking a narrow causeway. And then within the enclosure, there were remnants of 2 structures. One appeared to be a circular house, surviving only as a cut through the base, basically. Very difficult to be certain what's going on, but their best interpretation, it was a house. And the second was a 4-post structure, 3 meters square, that is still open to interpretation. Very few artifacts were recovered. I'm saying it's not about treasure hunting. There weren't just no shiny things in here. There are very few artifacts at all. This is a ploughed field originally. This was found in a ploughed field, so a lot of damage had been done. They did find some pottery and a few other bits and pieces, but it's mostly about trying to understand the building and the structure. And is this a fort? Does this have a fence around to defend itself, or does it have a fence around to keep the wolves out, or does it have a fence around it to keep the cattle in, or some combination of all of the above is possible? This is the sort of the thought processes that archaeologists have to go through, to try and take a jumble of stones and try and tell a story and paint a picture of what people might have been doing. I said it's not all about the shiny things, and it's not about treasure hunting, and it's not about the gold, except when it is. These are Iron Age objects. These are stunning. These are beautiful. These are solid gold. These are your classic Iron Age talks. Made. This is Celtic. This is what gets called Celtic art. There's 2 of 4 talks. There were 4 together as a hoard. They were found as a hoard of 4. And these also are from Brulé Drummond, where the Bronze Age wheel was found, or near to where the Bronze Age wheel was found. The wheel is very definitely Bronze Age, and these are definitely hundreds of years later into the Iron Age. But if the object on the left is a ribbon talk, a so-called ribbon talk, again, as I say, gold, flat disc terminals at the end, and then this incredible and amazing corkscrew spiral twist put into the gold. Seriously high quality workmanship here. And then there's this one on the right, a loop terminal talk, again of gold, a braided hoop. The terminals here linked by a chain here. And then if you see how this is made, this is gold wire. These individual wires would be even made from even finer wires twisted together, and then those wires twisted together. And this incredible fine detailed work. And the terminals here, where my cursor is, this must represent hours and hours and hours of work. Again, completely in gold. So it's not about the treasure, except when it is. But even this is the value to archaeologists of these objects is not their gold. It's that it's showing the what humans are capable of. It's showing the craft, the work, skill, and the developing technologies. So yes, these objects are beautiful to look at. Yes, these objects are incredibly valuable if you have to put a money value on them. But they're also incredibly valuable in an archaeological sense in the information we can gather from them, what we can learn from them. So I said about the Iron Age. The Iron Age could be said to have never stopped. In the textbooks of the Archaeology of Scotland, it usually has a chapter to itself, as if it does stop, and it stops with the Romans, the arrival of the Romans. Textbooks have to be divided up somehow. History has to be divided up somehow. It helps us understand. But I mean, another way of thinking of the Romans, rather than they brought the Iron Age to an end in Scotland, which of course they didn't. The Romans are possibly best thought of as just another Iron Age tribe. They brought no really new technology, except concrete, perhaps. That's possibly the only really new technology the Romans added. What they did bring was a significantly different, a significantly more complex form of social organization. It's that which creates the Roman Empire, not a technology that's significantly different. I'd represent that with this object. This is the Bridgeness Slab, found in 1868 at Bridgeness on a rocky promontory on which Bridgeness Tower stands. And what is it? It is a Roman distance slab. Which, as I said, I think sort of encapsulates who the Romans were, or how they thought of themselves, of course. And it's propaganda. It's boasting. It commemorates the construction of the eastern end of the Antonine Wall. And it commemorates those soldiers, legionaries who did the work. It was erected round about AD 142. The inscription in the middle, translated from the Latin, says, "For the Emperor Caesar Titus Aelius Hadrianus Antonius Augustus Pius, father of his country, the Second Augustan Legion completed the wall over a distance of 4,652 paces." A Roman pace was a double step. It was 5 Roman feet in length. So translated into new money, that's 7,722 meters. So they built the Second Augustan Legion, were responsible for the building 7,722 meters of the eastern end of the Antonine Wall. I said the Romans didn't really bring any technology other than concrete that wasn't already part of the local Iron Age communities. The other thing they did bring, of course, was literacy. This is the time when Scotland enters into history, if you like, in that it's the first time people and places are written about and written down. The indigenous Iron Age peoples were non-literate, and literacy appears. That said, this slab was as much as for the locals as it was in reality, probably more for the locals than it was for the Romans themselves. It's the Romans boasting, and they would know that most of the locals couldn't read the Latin. So what you have is the imagery, and this is telling the story of where the Romans don't mess with us, basically. On the left here, we have a Roman cavalryman on his horse with his spear. And of course, he's winning, and he's not just winning. One Roman cavalryman is beating 4 locals. They're naked. One's holding a shield up. One's about to get stabbed. In fact, has been stabbed. Sorry, this one has got a spear already, and he's about to get another one. One is a prisoner tied up, and one is not just a prisoner tied up, but has had their head cut off. This is don't mess with us. We're the winners. We have defeated you, Britons. We have defeated you, Caledonians. Don't resist the might of the Roman Empire. On this side, we've got the religious aspect of the Roman Empire, but obviously it's also basically what they're saying is not only have we got the Roman legions and the Roman army, which you can't possibly defeat, but one reason why you can't possibly defeat us is we've got the gods on our side. And this is actually a depiction of a ceremony that we know about, the so-called Suevetoria, which is a ceremony undertaken before important campaigns. It was popular with the military. It was something you would do before you went on campaign. And it's a multiple sacrifice of animals to the gods. It's a sacrifice of a pig, a sheep, and a bull to Mars, the god of war. No, there are musical instruments being played. It's been suggested that this is possibly to mask the squeals and the sounds of desperation coming from the animals that are about to be killed. There are 4 soldiers, and then there's a man in a toga pouring a libation, pouring wine onto an altar here, the same altar that the blood is going to be added to. And we even know the name of this person. He is probably Aulus Claudius Charax, and he was the commander of the 2nd Legion. Impressive enough as it's seen now, and this is, oops. But when it was originally erected, it would also, the traces can be seen, and it's also found on other distant slabs. There are multiple distant slabs found along the Antonine Wall. These objects were also painted and gilded. The headless person would probably have had dripping red blood. The spear might have had dripping red blood. There'd be red and gold on the writing, and similarly here. These would have stood out in the landscape. These would have been very impressive objects in the landscape, and striking bits of propaganda for whoever would see them, whether they could read or they couldn't. The Romans come and go. They never really conquer Scotland. They have 3 goes at it, and then they do a lot of bribery, and they're around for several hundred years. But they never, and they do go. They have incursions north of the Antonine Wall, quite far north up the east coast. There are small forts and things to be found. But they never stay for very long. They come back several times, but they never stay for very long, and they never settle in the sense that they do in England, or at least in southern England. And although I've said there's definitely Roman activity both on land and at sea, north of the Forth, there's very little sign in Fife. For some reason, they seem to have gone round Fife, possibly because the locals were well organised or prepared to fight back. Who knows? What we do have from Fife, from the time of the Romans and from the time after the Romans stopped coming, is that it's one of the places, it's the southern boundary of the territory that we associate with what we and the Romans call the Picts. An Iron Age people, an early medieval people, a pagan people who became a Christian people, a people who had a very distinct culture which existed for hundreds of years, but who are known by a name that was given to them by others. The word Picts, Pictoi, they were called that by Greeks, they were called by the Romans, they are called that by historians, they are called that by archaeologists. We have no idea what they called themselves. Pict is a name imposed upon them by posterity, by other people. How they refer to themselves, we don't know, and we might never know. As I said, that the fourth formed border, and this is one of the fourth sometimes formed border, and this is one of those times. So it's the southern border of what we now might call Pictland. The Picts themselves emerge as a coherent culture, as a coherent society, from, as a coming together of tribal societies in again what we call late Iron Age Scotland, and they partially probably are brought together by the Romans, by their resistance to the Romans. People realised they couldn't beat the Romans unless they cooperate. So the idea of a Pictish nation, if you like, emerges from the coming together of former peoples who realised they could only hold the Romans off by cooperating and collaborating. From the between the 6th and 9th centuries AD, their territory stretched along the whole of the east coast of Scotland, from the Firth of Forth to Shetland. And then in the 9th century, they unite with the Gaelic Scots, the Irish, the Gaelic speaking who came from Ireland, Scots. And that unification is also caused by external attacks, not the Romans this time, but that later unification to create a Scottish nation, if you like, or the earliest expression of a Scottish nation. And that's in the face of attacks from the north, from Norway and Denmark. And the Picts as a people at this point disappear, basically, because it all becomes one people, if you like, from then on. And the sort of the enigma of the Picts is that they left no written language of their own. Their history has always been told by others. That said, they left behind an incredible symbolic culture, which more and more starting maybe proto-writing, may have even been writing. It was certainly carried messages that we can't understand today, that are greatly open to interpretation. Repeated symbols over and over again, used on carved stone and on other objects. One of the best places to see some of these symbols is in our area. It's at the Weems Caves, at East Weems in Fife. There were initially at least 11 caves. Mostly to the east of the village of East Weems. There were 2 on the west side of the village, but they no longer exist. They've collapsed completely. There are 6 remaining caves on the coastline, most of which can be visited. Court Cave, Dew Cave, Well Cave, Jonathan's Cave, Sliding Cave, and Gasworks Cave. An incredible historic site, well worth a visit, preserved by the Save Weems Ancient Cave Society, who have a little museum and will take guided tours around when they're able to. The caves themselves have were in use from at least the Bronze Age and well into the possibly as recently as the early 20th century. Certainly in the 19th century, things like union meetings were held there, and village events were held in one of the big caves, well into sort of modern times. The earliest carvings on the walls go back to the Bronze Age, but the vast majority are Pictish, or what archaeologists would call Pictish, and they not just Pictish, they're all of one particular style. Pictish art is divided into 3 classes of art, imaginatively called Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. Simplifying a little bit, but basically Class 1 are pagan, Class 2 have a mixture of pagan and Christian imagery, and Class 3 are entirely Christian imagery. These are the earliest, Class 1, pre-Christian, and it's the highest concentration of Pictish cave carvings in the whole of Scotland. To put the rarity of the Weems caves in context, they contain 49 of only 60 examples of Pictish symbols documented in caves, and account for 5 of the 8 known caves in Scotland that have recorded Pictish symbols in them. As well as the Pictish symbols, they have other important historic carvings from the Pictish period, including in Jonathan's Cave, one of the few images we have of boats from this time. There's a 6-oared boat carved into the wall, which survives. The picture, the slide I've actually chosen, is to show the symbols weren't just carved into stone. There's the symbol stones which were out in the open. There's the cave carvings where they're carved into the wall. But the identical symbols in use here, if you can see, is this so-called Z rod, which has, where the cursor is now, sort of flames or leaves, branches at this end, and sort of fleur-de-lis stroke arrow at this end, and then this so-called dumbbell with 2 circles, and exactly the same symbol appears here, and with the dumbbells. And this could be a piece of modern jewellery. You do see pieces of modern jewellery with Pictish symbols. They're very popular and very common. This isn't a piece of modern jewellery though. This is a silver plaque from the so-called Norries Law hoard, found near Largo, so just up the road from Weems. So you've got the same carving on the wall of the cave at Weems, and you've got the same beautifully carved, engraved version of the same symbol into this stunning piece of silver. National Museum Scotland have researched this recently, and they think it's just part. You can see there's at the top. That would be a place where it was fastened and it would hang. It was probably the component of a late Roman period helmet, a type of helmet that was used across Iron Age Europe, 6th century, and these would all be hanging from a helmet. It would create incredible decoration to a helmet that a Pictish warrior would wear. I mentioned a few times about the Forth being a border. So what was on at the time when it was the southern border of Pictland, it was the northern border of Northumbria, of English-speaking, Anglo-Saxon-speaking kingdom of Northumbria, the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria, which for a while had its capital in Edinburgh. And this object was picked as it's beautiful, stunning again, classified as treasure again. It's gold again, like the Iron Age talks. But this is typical of Anglo-Saxon high status material culture, if you like. If anyone saw the film The Dig last year, which is a fictionalized dramatization of the excavation of the burial of an Anglo-Saxon king at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, well, if you see the helmet and the shield and the purse and all the other objects that came out of there, were made of the same materials. It's gold around a bronze core, and then it's got these garnets inserted. If I remember rightly, some of the garnets at Sutton Hoo came from as far, and some of the other precious and semi-precious stones came from as far as India. I don't know what the source of these ones were. It's perfectly plausible that they're exotic, if you like. They may have come hundreds or even thousands of miles. And again, incredible gold wire work, little spirals. But this wasn't found at Sutton Hoo. This wasn't found in England. This is this gold ornament, possibly the end of a sword, the pommel for a sword, is from Dalmeny Church in West Lothian. This was found, or was preserved, if you like, by the church and in the church. Dalmeny Church itself is well worth visiting. It's one of the finest surviving Norman parish churches in the whole of Scotland, and it preserved this even older than Norman, this pre-Norman, this Anglo-Saxon duo. Coming forward in time, the Forth has been a site, as we've seen, for multiple different cultures and the manufacture of amazing things. And these are all ancient history, if you like, some of them prehistory. Coming forward into industrial times, obviously the Forth continues to be the site for the manufacture of pottery. We saw pottery first rise in the Neolithic, and all our subsequent peoples use pottery: Bronze Age, Iron Age, Romans, Picts, Anglo-Saxons, medieval period. Pottery remains of huge importance for everyday life and sort of high status life as well. The industrial era, 18th and 19th centuries, certainly by the 19th century, there were two main concentrations in Scotland for the manufacture of pottery in factory industrial circumstances. Glasgow area was one, and a lot of pottery made there. And the other main area was our region, was the Forth, both sides, north and south of the Forth. According to Graham Cruikshank, who's widely regarded as the leading expert on this topic, on the north bank of the Forth, at the Firth of Forth, there were potteries at Alloa, Inverkeithing and Kirkcaldy. And on the south bank, there were potteries at Thrusk, Dunmore, Grangemouth, Bowness, Leith, Edinburgh, Potbellow, Musselburgh, West Pans, Morrison's Haven, Cuthill and Preston Pans, all manufacturing pottery on an industrial scale for use throughout Scotland, for use throughout England, for use and for export as well. So if you excavate any modern, by which I mean 18th, 19th, and early 20th century site in Scotland now, you will find, if you're lucky, any site, walk across a ploughed field, you'll find bits of 19th century pottery. But if you were looking for an excavating site, I'm involved with the Edinburgh Archaeological Field Society's current and ongoing excavations at Camel, the estate near Cramond, on the 4th. We're there every Monday. Come and say hello. Please bring jelly babies. And if you stay long enough, we'll put a trowel in your hand. We have found pottery like this across the site. This on the left is so-called Scottish spongeware. It's a white refined earthenware, which was then coloured and fired. Blue, red, purple, green and yellow variants are all found. It was made between 1840 and 1920. Things like this were made in England as well, but it's predominantly Scottish. And as I said, we've found examples at Camo in recent years during the excavation. We expect to find more. It's called spongeware because it's actually the colour is applied by taking a natural sponge, a sponge from the sea, and dipping that in the dye and adding the colour. It gives a particular sort of look to the object. If you want to see a lot of this stuff, or the best collection of this locally that I know of, it's in the Museum of Edinburgh on the High Street. Unfortunately, that is still closed due to the pandemic, but and we don't have a date for them reopening yet. But as soon as they do, they've got a superb collection of on public display of industrial period Scottish pottery. The big pieces on the right are stamped Scottish spongeware again, same sort of time period, the mid 18th to the early 20th century, sorry, mid 19th to the early 20th century. Again, mostly from Scotland, again, mostly from along the Forth. A lot of this is from Fife, and there's Weemsware and various others. Again, like the objects on the left, we found the same sort of type on the right at Camo as well. And this is made by cutting the sponge into different shapes and patterns, a bit like a potato print, and then stamping it on onto the piece before it's fired. As I said, we find all of these. We found Weemsware at Camo. The interesting thing about the actual objects on the slides here, however, I've taken these pictures all from a website of an archaeology museum, but it's the Anthropology and Archaeology Museum of St Mary's University in Halifax. In Halifax, Canada, that is, not Halifax, England. The scale, the principal overseas customer for spongeware was Canada, and a huge amount of it distributed from Quebec. And interestingly, from today's perspective, if you like, it was made along a river, the Forth, and it was distributed. It's found archaeologically today whenever settlements are excavated along the St. Lawrence River in Canada. So it was exported by sea, and then I mentioned about the Forth bringing things in right to the heart of Scotland. Well, the St. Lawrence did the same in Canada, and it's bringing Scottish pottery into the heart of Canada. And it's always interesting to sort of trace these Scotland going out into the world as well as the world coming to Scotland. I mentioned camo. I'll show two objects. We actually did recover a camo. As I said, we could have found these pottery. We found, particularly the one on the right, we found materials very much like that, even though that one was found in Canada. Well, we actually did find these camo just last month, in fact, and put dates on them exactly when we found them. The one on the left we found on May the 17th, and then on the right we found on May the 24th. And this is just to emphasize the river again as a place of import and export. The pipe on, and these are clay pipes. These are tobacco for the smoking of tobacco. Throughout the late 18th and early 19th century, these would be ubiquitous on any workplace, any farm, anywhere where there was working people. Really, this according to horrible histories, I do my research, cigarettes weren't introduced into Britain at all until 1841, and when they were, cigarettes would be a luxury item. People smoked vast quantities of tobacco, but in tiny little pipes like these. The one on the left, you can see it's got a shield with lozenge hatching in the shield, and the letters TW. We should be able to eventually track down who TW was. That'll be the manufacturer. The one on the right, you can see partial the stamp, which says David Poe, someone, City Road, I'm going to guess City Road, London. Again, the river as a place of import. These are found at Camo, Edinburgh, Scotland, on close to the Firth of Forth, but at least one of them has been brought in from London, presumably by sea. We have also, at the same site, found other imports, including of pipes, but including ones that were made in France. There's several pipes we've found where it had a French language and French made in Paris or wherever it was made in France. It was stamped on. And I'll close with those, as I think that brings us full circle in a way. The river is a border, but the river is a highway and a route and a place of export and import, as it is today. Still thriving communities doing different things in different places. Just a quick list of other places I'd recommend to visit. Everywhere's struggling at the moment with the pandemic, and not everywhere's open. Historic Environment Scotland are slowly and gradually reopening some of their sites. So Aberdour Castle was included in that. You can now visit there, well worth a visit. Abercorn is, I showed the Dalmeny Jewel, and that was Northumbrian, Anglo-Saxon. Abercorn is the site. Interesting in its from its name alone is interesting. Abercorn is from the Cumbric, the old, similar to Old Welsh, the language that was spoken south of the Forth before English was spoken. But Abercorn itself is mentioned by Bede, who wrote the first English history of the area. That in AD 681, a Northumbrian bishop of the Picts was sent to Abercorn. Not that the Picts had asked for a bishop to be sent, but was sent to try and sort of Anglicize and Christianize, presumably. But Abercorn itself was an incredibly important parish in the Anglo-Saxon Northumbrian phase of the south bank of the Forth. It's also, you can see 7th century Northumbrian crosses there, but also later Norse hogback, so-called hogback stones are at Abercorn as well. It's It's a multi-phase site and really important. It's not very well known. On the other hand, Dunfermline Palace and Abbey Nave are much better known, but still really well worth a visit. Interesting, historically important. East Lomond, Fife's Little Mountain, just outside Falkland, just above Falkland Palace, if you like, the village of Falkland. But also, interestingly, it's an industrial landscape. It doesn't look like it now, but if you wander about, you can find lime kilns. It's a beautiful place to be, but in the 18th century, it was actually an industrial landscape, well worth a visit. As is Calendar House Museum in Falkirk. I'm not sure if they've reopened yet or not, but keep your eyes open, and when they do, they're well worth a visit. St Monan's Kirk back in Fife now on the north side. I mentioned Dalmeny earlier as being one of the finest Norman churches in Scotland. Well, St Monan's is regarded as the finest high medieval parish churches in Scotland. It is also said to be the church in Scotland which is closest to the sea. I don't know whether anyone's actually done, the research and take a tape measure and actually measured it. It is said to be the church which is closest to the sea. Queensferry Museum, small, not very well known, probably hasn't been able to reopen just yet, but if you're in Queensferry and it is open, well worth a visit. Lots of stuff about, as you might expect, Queen Margaret and why Queensferry is called Queensferry, but lots of stuff about the Forth in general, and the bridges and everything else we've been talking about today, in a small local museum. Well worth a visit. And just to bring us into the 20th century and to show that the same activity was happening on both sides of the river, even up to modern horrors, if you like. There's a nuclear bunker, no longer used, at Anstruther, known as Scotland's Secret Bunker. Lovely to see the signs on the road to the secret bunker, which has been restored and pre-pandemic is open as a museum, well worth a visit. I'm not sure whether they've reopened yet. But on the Edinburgh side of the Forth, there's a similar thing in Barton Quarry, on Costoffen Hill, really, which is currently being restored, and they plan to open as a museum of the Cold War, and that is occasionally open on Doors Open Day in September, but is not fully restored yet. That's something to look forward to. If a visit to a nuclear bunker can be looked forward to, I am looking forward to it. References and further reading. I mentioned Graham Cruikshank at the top. He is the leading expert on Scottish pottery. The Firth of Forth, an environmental history, is a really good book. It covers similar to what I've done today, and it takes us from the Mesolithic to the modern era, with an emphasis on the environment. Mr. Websites, all worth visiting. EAFS is Edinburgh Archaeological Field Society. They mentioned digging at Cramond, at Camo, near Cramond. Come and say hello. And thank you for watching and listening today. Thank you very much.